cadmiums, the cobalts, the phthalos, the quinacridones. What are these colors? What do they actually mean? Do you have to know absolutely everything about pigments before you can buy watercolors? Absolutely not, but it is really interesting. Hey, in this video, we're going to be demystifying watercolor pigments. And to complement this video, I will also be putting my notes in a PDF and making it available for free for all my Ko-fi members. So definitely check that out in the description. I am not an expert. I'm just someone who's loved watercolors for the past couple of years and who still remembers what it's like being a beginner. This video was kindly requested by one of my Ko-fi members, hey Lorna, and it really piqued my interest because the more research I did, the harder I found it to actually find all the information that I wanted in one place. So in this video, I'm going to consolidate the majority of the information that I found that I feel would be a really good foundational step for someone who is interested in pigments, interested in watercolors, doesn't really know where to start. Naturally, the first question is, what are pigments? And pigments are fine colored powders that are added to binders to create paints. And depending on what binder they're added to is what will essentially determine what the paint will be. Pigment names are based on the chemical composition of the actual pigment as opposed to the color or the hue that they appear, and we'll talk about this in more detail through the video. So watercolors are made up of pigments that are then added to binders and then have other things like preservatives added to it to make what we call watercolor paint. And the pigments are the elements that quite often give the properties that we know of. They're sometimes and most often what also determines the price. The pigment quality will vary from brand to brand, but they are quite often what we use to identify watercolors and to have a bit of a better idea as to what the color is going to be like. When you get your watercolor paints, you will notice that they will have a number of names. So there'll be the first name. So this might be something like ultramarine, or they'll have names like permanent green or Indian yellow, etc., etc. These names will vary between brands, and even if they have the same name across the brand, it does not necessarily mean that it's the same color. It doesn't mean that it has the same pigments. It's just entirely up to the brand to pick their names, which is why sometimes you'll have a color like permanent green, for example, that doesn't actually correspond to any pigment. It's just the name that the brand has chosen for it. And although these names are quite often common, they do not necessarily correspond to the same color across the brands. I would advise to take names that are given by the brands with a pinch of salt. And this is why it can come in handy to actually learn more about the pigments so that you know what you're actually getting as opposed to what the brand has named it. When it comes to the pigment names, you'll quite often see that it's called P for pigment, followed by a letter, followed by a number. And the letter in the middle corresponds with the color or the hue, if you like. So for example, you'll have PB29, which is pigment blue 29. This is an ultramarine color. You may notice PY for yellows, PR for reds, PB for blue, PW for whites, PBR for browns, PG for greens, PV for violets, and so on and so forth. And I think I've covered most of them. And then you'll get a corresponding number. And the letter P for pigment, the following letter for the color or hue that it is, followed by the number, is what is known and referred to as the pigment name. And this is what is used to identify that pigment. So each pigment has a pigment name. But the reason that you may notice that the same pigment number has several different names across several different brands is because the brand gets to pick the name of the paint. If you want to get even more technical, you can look at like the constitution numbers, but that is honestly too far for me and I think too much for a beginner. In some instances, you'll notice the word hue in the name, for example, quinacridone gold hue. This quite often means that the pigments that are used inside this paint are trying to recreate another pigment. This can be done for a number of different reasons. For example, in some student grade brands, you'll notice that they do that because they're using cheaper pigments to recreate more expensive pigments. But this can also be done across professional brands. Sometimes if a pigment has been discontinued or if it's no longer available, or if it's too expensive, that is when this is done. Now, a brand doesn't have to say that it's a hue, but if you see the word hue, then you know that that's essentially what they have done. Likewise, if they have given it the name of a pigment, but when you look at the pigment information, it has multiple pigments or it doesn't have that actual pigment in it, then it is a hue. A good example of this is quinacridone gold, which I believe was P049 and is no longer available. So what brands have started doing is creating quinacridone gold hues using different pigments to recreate that color that was very much liked amongst people, and it's actually one of my favorite colors. Sometimes you'll end up having watercolors that have no pigment information in them. Now, this tends to be the case if it's student grades or perhaps slightly cheaper sets, and ultimately means that you can't make any assumptions about the properties of the paints or what's actually inside the paints. From my perspective, if I like the paints, then I won't mind and I will use them nonetheless, but I will bear in mind that they are probably of a lesser quality than paints that actually have the pigment information. So those type of paints I would probably reserve for like just for fun art or art in my sketchbook, as opposed to anything that I would want to hang up or anything that I would want to sell, especially because having pigment information is seen as a good thing. So if it's omitted, then it's probably that it's not something that they necessarily want to show off. So sometimes it may mean that it's dye-based rather than pigment-based paints. Just in case you were curious, paints can either be organic or inorganic, and the other they can be natural or synthetic. And for the most part, the pigments that we have in most of our paints are synthetic inorganic. They are man-made, they replicate minerals and metals, and they are more affordable, more stable, and more light-fast. These are quite often the colors that have the words cadmium or cobalt or viridian or titanium. We also have quite a bit of synthetic organic. They are carbon based, but they are manufactured, so they're actually man-made. These are colors like perylines, the dioxazine, quinacridones, the azos, and the phthalos all fall into this category, and we'll touch on them a little bit later, but the paints that you've heard that have these kind of names would fall into this category. Next, we have the natural organic pigments. Now, these are hardly ever used now. They are either plant-based or animal-based and had more of a significance in the past. They were things like Madder Lake or the deep red carmine or dragon's blood, which Jackson's recently did a paper on. They're not stable and they're not light fast. These pigments tend to start with the letter N, so N for natural. So like I said, hardly ever used, but in case you're curious. Natural inorganic are things like minerals and metals, which are ground up to create the pigments that then create the paints. These are rarely used. They tend to be quite expensive when they are used, and you need a lot of it to make a little bit of paint. They are not that common. I think it's part of the like Primatech controversy that was going on, and they tend to be weaker pigment. So for the most part, we have synthetic paints that are either organic or inorganic, and I will talk about that a little later. I'm going to be talking about paint properties in quite a bit of detail, so I'm talking staining, light fastness, transparency, and granulation, with the hopes that it will then make sense when I talk about it later on. If you're quite confident with these terms and you understand, then just feel free to skip forward to the parts where I talk about the pigment families, and I'll leave all the timestamps down below. Certain pigments have certain qualities. I've already alluded to this in my swatch book videos and some of my swatching videos, but the properties I'm talking about are transparency, staining, so how easily does it lift, granulation, as well as light fastness. And I'll talk about how each of these properties relate to families of different pigments in a second. Quite often with watercolors, we talk about their transparency. So are they transparent? You can see through them. Are they semi-transparent? So they leave like a little bit of residue. Are they semi-opaque? So they're a little bit thicker, perhaps a bit chalkier, or are they completely opaque, which tends to be less common with watercolors, but there are some, especially yellows, that may lean more towards the opaque side than the transparent side. Why does this matter? It quite often depends on how you use your watercolors. So for example, if you like doing glazes on your watercolors, which means you like doing a painting and then painting over it and painting in layers and building up, then you may want something that's a little bit more on the transparent end. I will quite often try to determine this in my swatches by having a black line or some sort of drawing that I then paint over to see how much of that I can see through. So for example, in these swatches, the yellow ochre natural is semi-transparent or semi-opaque because the black line isn't coming through quite as clear as all the other colors. Sometimes people want something that's a little bit more opaque so that they can add a bit more oomph and stand on top of it, and it's entirely up to you and totally depends on how you want to use the paint. So it doesn't mean that transparent paint is good and opaque paint is bad. It just depends on how you're using it. This is quite often represented by either having a square or a circle. So one that's complete, that just has the outline, for example, is transparent. One that's half crossed is semi-transparent, and one that is completely covered is opaque. The next property is staining, and this quite often is represented by a triangle. Some brands don't have it at all. What staining refers to is that essentially when you put down the paint and then you come back, re-wet it and try to rub it off or to lift it or to take it off, there will still quite clearly be a tinge of that colour on that paper. And that is what it means for it to be staining. I often test this when doing swatches by going back and wetting an area and trying to lift it with a paper towel. So essentially the colours that are staining are the colours that won't lift. More times than not, these are paints that have quite fine pigments like Phthalos and quinacridones, and I'll talk about this in more detail later on. I just wanted to really highlight the different properties so that it makes sense when we kind of review them later on as to why some people prefer certain pigments over others. Next thing is granulation, and essentially granulation is when the particles of the pigments start to separate on the paper. You quite often see this very nicely if you're using cold press paper or if you're using rough paper, but also sometimes you can really exaggerate it by adding lots of water. Not all pigments are granulating, and the ones that tend to be granulating are like cobalt or earth pigments or pigments that have big structures. The swatches on screen now are examples of beautiful granulation. You'll see that I've written the pigment information as well as the name they've been given, but at least one of the pigments in these mixtures are what one would describe as a granulating pigment. PBK11, which is quite often used as Mars Black, is one, PB36 is another granulating one, and PBR7, which is often a sienna or an umber, is again granulating. Some paints, for example, like the Schmincke supergranulating paints, how they achieve things like that is by having two watercolor paints that are both quite granulating and mixing them together so that you can then see the separate colors separating as well. Or they'll mix a really bright, beautiful tinting, non-granulating color like a phthalo or a quinacridone and mix this with a granulating color like a PBK11 or a PB36 and then give your two beautiful granulating colors. And by the end of this video, you'll have a bit more of an understanding so that you're actually able to look at what's inside these paints and see how you can recreate them yourself. And that's essentially the mystery or the beauty behind the super granulating watercolors. If you want more content like this, if you want to know more about pigments, you want me to compare different brands, you want more information, then please let me know down below in the comments. I had a lot of fun doing it, and if it's something that you want to know more about, then it's something that I'm definitely happy to share. And the other thing that's quite important to note is lightfastness. What this is essentially alluding to is to what extent, if at all, will this paint fade if it's exposed to light. And there is something called ASTM. This essentially was initially American, but now it's used worldwide as a way to kind of grade the lightfastness of different paints. And for example, if it's rated a 1, then that means that it's excellent lightfastness. It should last for years and years and years and years if exposed to light. Even more so if it's in a sketchbook and hardly sees the light of day, for example. Then there's 2, 3, 4, all the way down to 5, which is essentially fugitive. And what that means is that this color will fade. Different people will place different amounts of importance to this because, like I said, it depends on whether it's going to be in a sketchbook or whether it's art that you're going to sell, art that's going to be on a wall. Is it going to be exposed to light or not at all? But the only reason I think it might be helpful to know is to just be aware of the colors that, for example, are completely fugitive, so that you know and you can make the appropriate decisions accordingly. So you may perhaps decide not to sell that piece of art, or you may decide that you use it in your sketchbook, or you may decide that if there are two colors which to you pretty much look the same, one is rated fugitive, so V, and the other one is rated excellent lightfastness, and they're the same price and they look similar to you, you may choose to go for the one that's actually light fast, the one that isn't going to fade on you. The thing to be aware of, and the reason why sometimes there's like a little bit of contention when it comes to light fastness, is that companies aren't always as honest about the actual light fastness, or it's not necessarily that they're lying, is that perhaps they are tested differently. So what is being communicated isn't what is expected. And what I mean by that is that, for example, sometimes brands will rate their lightfastness out of 3, but no one knows how that then corresponds to a more robust form of testing. We don't know how long they've left it in the sunlight. We don't know how they tested it. We don't know if they actually diluted it as they should. And there are differences, for example, if you were to check the lightfastness of like a thick blob of paint versus a diluted bit, the one that's diluted, which actually more closely resembles how you would use your watercolor, is going to fade faster than the thick blob of paint. But a company doesn't necessarily have to test it that way. This is why quite often you will notice that people will run their own lightfastness tests. This is why lightfastness tests are so popular on YouTube, because it gives you a bit of a better idea as to whether your paints are going to last. I thought it may be helpful for you to also have insights into the families of colors. So for example, the cadmiums, the cobalts, the phthalos, the quinacridones. What are these colors? What do they actually mean? In a nutshell, they refer to the family of the pigment that is used to create that paint. Also, they're like molecular their molecular structure, so it does get quite scientific. The first one, for example, is cobalt. And the cobalt family of pigments include a wide range of colors, including deep forest green, warm blues, golden yellows, cold violets, and many different variations in between. They are bright, they are granulating, they are low to moderate tinting strengths, and they are usually described as slightly gritty or granular, usually very permanent, all apart from cobalt yellow, which is called Aurelian, Aureolin. I'm saying it wrong, but this color, Aurelian, goes from being like a beautiful, nice, warm, sunny yellow to a dirty brown with time. So that is perhaps a color that I would advise you just avoid. PY40, just completely avoid it. So as you can see, these are just some of the cobalt colors, and they are the ones that I have. I thought it would be nice for you to see them across different brands. So again, you can see that there are subtle differences in the way that they behave, in the way that they granulate, and also in the actual hues, so the actual shade of them. So for example, if you compare this cobalt blue with this one, you can see that the one by the Rosa Gallery is slightly deeper and darker. You could also see that the Jackson's one granulates the most out of all of them. And the cobalt blue hue is actually made up of PB29 and PW5. So in this instance, because it's of the Cotman range, which is the student range, rather than getting the actual pigment for cobalt blue, which is PB28, they have tried to make it by using the ultramarine and adding a little bit of white. And you can see the colors are quite similar. Then so there is cerulean blue, which is PB35, and also PB36 is also a cobalt color. This quite often is nice for making like nice sky blues. It's not as tinted, but it does tend to granulate. But you can see that here with the Winsor & Newton, we have the cerulean blue hue. So instead of using the actual pigment, they used PB15, which is a phthalo blue. Pretty, but clearly different. You can then get cobalt turquoise or cobalt teal or cobalt green, which are PG50. And then cobalt teal between Roman Schmall and Daniel Smith, both are beautiful, but both behave completely different. So you can see that the one by Daniel Smith is granulating in a really nice way, whereas the cobalt teal gives you this really nice even finish by Roman Schmall. And these are my cobalt colors. Their main characteristics are that they are bright, they're granulating, they're low to moderate tinting, semi-transparent, and usually light fast, apart from PY40, which is a yellow. You can then get cobalt violet, which is very granulating, and this PV14. I don't like that color. As of October 2022, I don't like that color. And that is pretty much it for the cobalt. And the only other thing to mention with cobalts and cadmiums, for example, is that they sometimes come with health warnings, which basically say something along the lines of they haven't been known to cause harm to humans by using them. However, they theoretically could. So you basically shouldn't ingest it and you shouldn't inhale it. So don't use it for airbrushing, for example. Don't lick your brush and then don't lick your brush to clean it. Next, we have the cadmiums, and the cadmiums are known to have high tinting strength. They have very good coverage. They're excellent light fastness, and they are often dense and opaque. They range from a whitish yellow, for example, PY35, through to middle yellows like PY37, and then orange PO20, scarlets, reds, and a deep red PR108. And they are quite often very much liked because they are also light fast, so they won't fade. Next, we have the quinacridone pigments range between purples to oranges, but are commonly a pink red. This family tend to be strong in color, stable, light fast. They're quite often very staining and non-granulating. Also come in a reddish orange PO48, in a red PR209, in a coral PR207, in a red PV19, a rose PV19. PV19 is a good example of a color that has multiple variants. So it comes in a rose, in a red, and in a violet. Then it comes to the phthalos, and phthalo is short for phthalocyanine. I'm probably saying that wrong, but you get the idea. Phthalos, as they are affectionately called, are a family of blue and green synthetic organic pigments. Phthalo pigments are transparent, they're highly staining, and they are reliably light fast, and they are also non-granulating. Examples include phthalo blue red shade, which is PB15-1, phthalo blue green shade, which is PB15-3, which is the more common colder color. You can also get phthalo green, which is PG7, and can be used to make a beautiful turquoise if mixed with a phthalo blue. And then you also get phthalo green yellow shade, which is PG36. And the main thing to say with phthalos is that they are beautiful, very bright, very electric colors. So they sometimes get a bad rep because they can be quite domineering on a painting. They will command attention, but I do find that they're quite nice to mix with other colors if you like dull them down a little bit. So if you add a bit of a complementary color or you use them as a mixing color, then you can create some really beautiful colors, and that's why they stick in my mind. And I think they're the first family of watercolors that I was really aware of, because the blues were electric blue. And then the last family that I'll touch on is the earth pigments. The color of earth pigments are determined by various metal oxides, so usually iron and manganese. They used to be made by clays and minerals. Earth pigments are extremely light fast and permanent. And the most common examples of these are PY43, for example, which is pigment yellow 43, which is also known as yellow ochre, sometimes called natural yellow ochre, and has a whole bunch of different names, as we've already addressed, depending on the brand. The synthetic version of PY43 yellow ochre is PY42. Sometimes in brands you'll notice that is also called yellow ochre. Sometimes they're mixed together. And then one of my favorites is the umbers and the sienna. And that is PBR7, so it's a brown pigment, and you can have raw sienna, burnt sienna, raw umber, burnt umber, and the darkest of them is burnt umber, the lightest of them is raw sienna. Raw sienna is like a deep darkish yellow, and what essentially determines this is, one, the content of the manganese, which is how this one pigment has 4 completely different colors. So one is the content of the manganese, which will determine whether it's a sienna or whether it's an umber. But then if it's heated or exposed to heat, it then turns to the burnt component of it. So that's how you get the burnt sienna, and that's how you get the burnt umber. And then another one in this category would be Terra Verde, which is PG23. And this is, again, another color that I haven't heard the greatest things about. It tends to have a very, very low tinting strength. And what that means is that it's a very, very weak pigment. If you mix it with anything else, that other color will completely overpower it. It's really granulating, but you can't really mix it. Now, you know what it is. It's an earth pigment. So you may be wondering, how is it that one color can have the same pigment, but vary so drastically? There are a number of different answers for that. One is that pigments can come in a different quality. So for example, the quality of a pigment in one brand isn't necessarily the quality of a pigment in a different brand. The other is that they are formulated differently, have different binders in them, they'll have different quantities of pigment in them. Another thing to be aware of is that pigments can also sometimes have different variants. An example of that is PV19, a pigment that I love. This is P pigment V violet 19, and it's a quinacridone color, but it has 3 variants. So there's a rose version, there is a red version, and there is a violet version, but all of them are called PV19, and the brands don't necessarily have to disclose which one they use to create this paint. Another one that perhaps may come to mind is phthalo blue. so PB15, but there is PB15-1, which is the red shade, and there's PB15-3. For that reason, the same pigment can make drastically different looking watercolors. Based on this, can I tell you what the best colors are? I personally cannot, because I think ultimately it comes down to personal preference, and it depends on what you're painting, it depends how you want to use your paints. On handprint.com, which is a great website, the owner, the writer of handprint.com, actually wrote out their top 40 pigments, and if you want me to do a video about that, then I definitely can, but I will leave all that information down below because it's interesting. And these are the top 40 pigments that he recommends based on lightfastness, based on mixing capabilities, but it will be different for every single artist. A portrait artist is not necessarily going to want to have the same colors as a landscape artist. So take it with a pinch of salt. It's definitely a good place to start, but I wouldn't go out of your way to break your back to get those colors. Another thing that you may ask, or you may be wondering, is what is the big deal with using single pigment colors? Why do people talk about that? And essentially the idea behind that is that if you use a color that has a single pigment, you are able to create cleaner, nicer mixes and avoid creating mud or avoid creating like neutral, messy looking colors because you're mixing so many different pigments together. And there is a bit of truth to it, although it's not entirely true, because it is possible to mix some really muddy looking, grey looking colours that are single pigments. And it's also possible to create really nice looking colours by mixing a colour that has 3 pigments with a colour that has 1 pigment, for example. So it's more a question as to the relationship between the colours, and more so thinking about whether the colour is a cool colour, which means it leans towards blue, or is it a warm colour, leans towards red, and how you're mixing them together. So that is essentially where the concern over having single pigment watercolors comes from. And the other thing is that sometimes in cheaper brands, for example, you will see that different pigments are mixed together to try and create a color that a single pigment that perhaps costs more would have been able to create. You may notice that student grade brands, for example, have more colors that are made with multiple pigments, whereas professional brands have more colors that are made with 1 or 2 pigments. I do think that what would be helpful is having a look at these databases. For example, Jane Blundell's site, Handprint by Bruce, or Dr. Otto Cano, who's also just created a database as well, and Kim Crick, I believe. These sites are incredible and are a treasure trove of information when it comes to pigments. What I would advise is that if you are going to buy a single color and you're not sure which one you should get, perhaps it would be good to have a look at these websites, any one of them, they're all quite good, and then getting information about that one pigment color that you are getting, trying to see your colors as pigments rather than as the color name that the brand has given them based on marketing. Because I feel like the pigment information in that respect can give you a bit of a better idea as to the actual properties and quality of the color that you're buying. And I think that this is ultimately the best way to build your best palette, by picking colors that you like and double checking before you buy them that they actually have the properties that you want. And if you care about lightfastness, you'll ensure that the colors that you get are all excellent lightfastness. And I think the same thing applies if you're thinking about buying a color and perhaps it's more expensive. Having a look on these sites, on the sites that I've mentioned, will be really helpful, because they are independent and they are skilled and they're watercolorists and they don't have skin in the game, so they can actually tell you how it is, whether this pigment is worth getting or whether you should get a different one, or whether it's a waste of money or whether it's really great. Now, some of the benefits about knowing pigment information. It may literally just be that you're curious and you wanted to know this information, and that is completely fine. It may be that you like chemistry and you want to know about the molecular structure of paint, and that is again completely fine. But it also has a lot of added benefits. It can help you make a more informed decision when you're trying to pick between pigments, or you're trying to determine whether a palette is a good deal or whether they're actually just filling it with cheap pigments and cheap colors. Another thing is that it can help you look at your palettes differently, in terms of you can mix some really beautiful colors yourself. If, for example, you're really intrigued by granulating colors or the super granulating colors, with a bit of understanding about what pigments are actually in those granulating colors, you can buy a few paints and actually make them yourself. Essentially, the pigment information is the recipe for how you can mix them. It can help you understand the differences in prices between colors colors in the same brand. And also, if for example, you were considering buying Daniel Smith sticks, which are sticks of watercolor, they are all currently the same price, and the pigments are not the same quality. So there are some pigments that, for example, would be more expensive if you bought them in a tube or if you bought them in a pan, that are actually all the same price across sticks. So you may feel more inclined to buy them in stick form. But honestly, the more you look, the more you learn. Like, the more you look, the more you see. Like, I spent hours reading up on all of this, because it turns out that the information is definitely there, it's just in lots of different places. For that reason, I will link all the resources down below in the description. I'll also create a PDF of my notes for my Ko-fi members as a special thank you, so thank you. Do you have to know absolutely everything about pigments before you can buy watercolors? Absolutely not. Can you enjoy watercolors without knowing pigment information? Yes, you can. But it is really interesting, and I assume that if you're watching this, you're somewhat interested, and I hope that I've given you a bit of a starter insight and enough information to carry on your own if you wish to do so, but enough information if you don't. And when it comes to colors to avoid, again, this will come down to personal preference. It depends on what you're trying to get out of the paints and what properties you want in the paints themselves. Some that come to mind, so for example, Aureolin, which is cobalt yellow, PY40, that fades. Like, honestly, the change, I can't remember whose video it was, but I saw how it started, beautiful and golden, and I was like, oh, this is perfect, to how it ended. It just really stuck in my mind as a color to perhaps avoid, especially as there are so many nicer yellows that will not fade in that way. Another one is, for example, Madder, I want to say Madder Lake or Rose Madder, so the actual original one, because that again will fade. There's also a really good list on handprint.com of some of the colors that are not as good. In terms of helpful sites that I would recommend, Dr. Otto Kano just created one, and she's also a YouTuber and has a wonderful videos, so I'd definitely recommend her. Handprint.com has been invaluable in like all the reading I've been doing. There's Kim Crick, there's Jane Blundell. I will link some really helpful websites and blogs and resources down below in the description so that you can read more about this if you want. I also encourage you to have a look in the comments to see what other people say, because I think that there is so much depth to this topic and there are so many people that have so much knowledge on the topic that you'll probably learn a whole bunch of information from the comments as well. So if you feel like you want to add to this video, by all means, with kindness, do so in the comments. If you are still watching, then you are most definitely a real MVP, and I really, really, really appreciate you. Let me know that you are still watching by telling me what some of your favorite colors are, and if you happen to know the pigment names, then bonus points. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye. Fugitive, so 5V, one is, whoops, not swearing,